Talking about the retail shops like malls, cinemas, hospitality, they are badly hit in these times.
Right.
From a health standpoint, is there a reasonable time frame when they can get back on their feet?
I think that's a tough one. It requires a certain ability to estimate the future course of things.
Yes.
Mm, so I've seen several estimates of recovery,
Yes.
resilience in recovery, and I think now the focus and consensus is emerging around, and I'm attending to the time question first.
Yes. Yes.
Is 18 months or
18
beyond,
months or beyond.
which puts us at the end of 2021.
Okay.
What does this mean for services sectors? So you know that the services sectors has been at the front of all the declines, associated declines related to the pandemic. Their revenues are down to a greater magnitude. The loss of consumer base, clearly. Margins have suffered. Liquidity problems have emerged, which means that they cannot afford the wage bill. They cannot afford to pay salaries to their workers, formal, informal, and I think the problem is persistent across. We know that the formal sector has access to certain programs and schemes introduced by the Indian government and the states, but there's a big question on how fast the system could move.
Yes.
So 18 months and beyond is what we are looking at, and that's a problematic time frame because a lot of the MSMEs most likely will not be able to weather the storm that long. And the question then becomes, what is the projection of such effect on small businesses, on the livelihoods of those individuals who engage with them, who work in them? So that's a big question. I think I'll leave that question for later.
Yes.
But let us also understand why the services sector has been affected. I think I touched upon this earlier, that limitations on collective consumption. And I think these things are going to continue in the near term. They are going to continue most likely to the extent that consumers are comfortable to be around other individuals. And I think that depends both on the suppression strategies being used, that is, the distancing and isolating and contact tracing and others, and mitigation strategies that are emerging, and hopefully sooner than later, in terms of medical solutions and vaccinations that will manage the harmful effects of the contagion when it gets to the people it does get to, that is after infection. So till the time consumers are comfortable to be back in surroundings adjacent to other individuals, I think that would be the time when we should expect businesses to start nearing a near normal, if not a pre-pandemic normal.
Yes, indeed. That's a perfect solution. We can think about like 18 months from now, that is from month of June, we can say, and tourism sector is also affected badly. So yeah, like moving on to other questions, like in your opinion, what are the long-term problems that are yet to arise as a result of COVID-19? Is there any way that we can brace ourselves for that?
When you say long term, of course, you're talking about the longer term economic outcomes rather than the short term health crisis. There's several that we can talk about. Let me begin by talking about slow growth. I think the problem of slow growth is magnified for India in particular, South Asia in more general. As you know, in the pre-pandemic time, growth had already slowed down to approximately 5% year on year.
Yes.
And if I recollect well, from 8.3% in FY 2017, it was down to, I think, 5.1.
Even 4.5. Yes.
Right. It has been revised down furthermore in FY20 and furthermore in FY21. some estimates suggest that there's going to be a recovery beyond FY21. But that those estimates have high confidence intervals, which then means that there is a lot of room for variation in what we will observe. So slow growth is a problem, and it is a problem because the last decade or so, and especially in the last 5 to 7 years, gains on poverty alleviation were quite marked in India.
Yes.
The dividends of economic growth were finally being reaped by a wider majority of the population, which then means that the issue of poverty, the sticky issue of poverty, was being addressed. That is, fewer people, however we define poverty, were below the poverty line, and I think that there's enough statistics on that to require more articulation. And I think that pace of change is at risk when we see slower economic growth now and in the future. So that's the first problem. The other problem is that the pandemic magnifies the vulnerabilities of our society. That is, and when I say society, it's the people who have less, people who are poor. And the reason for that is there are certain characteristics, or let us say access issues to people who live in poverty that make them more susceptible to the health risks of the pandemic. For example, concentrated household settings in which there is just per square meter there's a higher number of people, and that, as you know, because of the nature of the virus, that increases the risk of exposure. Some statistics also suggest that in India and elsewhere in South Asia, the reach of sanitation practices was also conditional on economic well-being, which means that sanitation practices which could prevent the spread of the virus may also be less practiced and common in some parts. So these are some of the problems of the poor. Let me also touch upon the issue, and I think it's a very timely and topical issue, of migrant laborers who we have seen an exodus from urban centers to rural areas. So the migrant labor who work in urban India are, in one way to characterize them, is surplus labor, agricultural sector labor from rural areas who have been able to find meaningful livelihoods and employment in urban areas. Now that they come back to their villages, the countryside, and smaller towns where they hail from, the livelihood problem becomes even more magnified, because a significant portion of society, that is, who was previously working, whether formal or informal, has now become dependent on livelihood because employment opportunities have been forcibly taken away from them because of the virus, the pandemic. So this magnifies the vulnerabilities of the poor. There's a third issue also that I see, and the issue is about human capital and skills.
Yes.
The issue related to human capital and skills is that the disruptions that we see in the economy, we also see similar disruptions in the education sector. Yes. And the youth of the country are disproportionately negatively affected by disruption in human capital accumulation because of the closure of schools and colleges and universities, I do not know how long it will take to go back to a new normal or new ways of education. And yes, I'm sure technology can pave a way towards the solution and efficiency. However, the time that has already been lost and the time that is being lost till we catch up to the technology frontier, I think represents a human capital loss and opportunity. And I think that's a third vulnerability whose effects we will be realizing in the future.
Yes,